It's time to get seeds and plants in the ground, and you're looking forward to a big harvest. But if you follow the directions on many seed packages, you won't get nearly the harvest that you could. I really like to max out my space and grow as much as possible. So stick around as I show you 10 ways that I get more food in less space. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and in this bed I've got a few hundred seeds that I put in. They're just starting to germinate using this very first method, and it's growing closer than the seed packages often recommend. If you follow the seed package as directed on these radishes, it says to have the plants spaced 1 inch apart. In rows, 12 inches apart. And so now stop and think about this, because that's what this first step requires. If we can put plants 1 inch apart in one direction, why can't we put them 1 inch apart in other directions? Why do we need 12 inches between those rows? So particularly in a bed like this, my radishes are all 1 inch apart with this particular type. And here's a Swiss chard, similar example. It says the seed spacing is 6 inches apart, but the row spacing is 18 inches apart. Why not just grow all of the plants 6 inches apart? And so here's what this looks like with a plant like chard. In a row, we would put our plants 6 inches apart. Then following the recommendations of the seed packet, the next row would be 18 inches from that one with each of the plants 6 inches apart. But if we put all of our plants 6 inches apart, we can start here, go up 6 inches in this direction, 6 inches in this direction, and we're gaining 2 complete rows of Swiss chard, because now all of our plants are 6 inches apart and we're not wasting all of this middle space. And so by shifting to a block planting pattern instead of the row as recommended by a lot of the seed packages, we've already doubled the amount of plants growing. Using Swiss chard as an example again, we'd have 2 rows of 10, and now we've got 4 rows of 10. Instead of 20 plants, we've got 40 plants. And you can increase this even more with another method that's called precision planting, where you can squeeze the plants in even closer. With precision planting, we're able to plant even more closely together. So back to the Swiss chard, these plants are 6 inches apart, but because of the diagonal, these plants are actually more than 6 inches apart. And so if we get very precise and we measure 6 inches from this plant, and that corresponds to 6 inches from this plant, we'd put another plant right there. And then we do the same thing. We'd come over about 6 inches from both directions, and here's a plant there. And then we just continue going 6 inches from each of our plants, and then from those plants will come out 6 inches in both directions. And eventually it looks like staggered rows of plants, so that each row is a little bit closer. And as we continue doing this in all the other directions, we find that we can squeeze in a lot more in a given space. And so you'll often see this referred to as a diamond planting pattern, because we're getting all of the plants 6 inches apart in all directions. So going from a recommended row planting to a block planting that just makes sense, doubled the number of plants we could put in. And by taking a little extra effort with precision planting in a diamond pattern, you can increase it another 20%. I was able to fit in 48 Swiss chard on that paper by using that diamond, compared to the 40 that we would have had with just a simple block. And depending on the type of plant you grow, you can squeeze in even more. The spacing recommendations that are on the seed packages come from a full-grown plant. We'll go ahead and grow some salad crops, what's often called a cut and come again, like a spinach or a lettuce. You don't have to wait for those plants to grow to full size. So the recommended spacing might be 6 or 8 inches. Well, you can get away by cutting that back to 4 or 5 inches because you're going to be harvesting the leaves before the plant gets to full size. Here's what that looks like with these spinach plants that are growing closer than recommended. I'll come in here and I'll pull off the outer leaves of the inner growing plants. So before the plant gets to full size, I just come out pretty much every day and harvest the outer leaves. It takes some time, a little bit of effort, but you're able to keep the plant smaller than full size and get a regular harvest. With a lot of the other plants that we're growing in our garden, start thinking about growing up and not out. Think about using a trellis, like my favorite tomato trellis. One of the reasons that you'll see some of these recommendations for the rows being so far apart is because the seed company is expecting that you're going to let your plants sprawl. Well, if you grow vertically, if you grow up a trellis, you can plant all of your plants closer together. And instead of spreading out and taking up space, well, they're growing up and taking all the space above the ground that would not otherwise be used. I have other videos that show this in much more detail, but the basic idea is to train your plants either on the outside or the inside of a trellis, or like I do, where I'll plant underneath a trellis and then train the vining plants like squashes and cucumbers and melons, and especially tomatoes, up the twine, and the trellis supports all of that growth. Learn to grow more than just one type of plant in a given bed. Often, we'll plant nothing but tomatoes in this bed, because especially when we grow vertically, the tomatoes will get quite tall and they'll shade out a lot of the areas in this bed. But that doesn't mean I can't grow other plants underneath the tomatoes. Learn to take advantage of some of those shady spots that typically we're not using. So during the summer, I might actually be able to grow some spinach and some lettuce underneath these tomatoes or behind the tomatoes where they're shaded. By having a little bit of extra shade, some of the plants that we're growing, mostly the salad crops, can still grow and avoid bolting during the heat of the day because the other plants are shading them out. This comes with some experience and you have to know your plants, but you can match the shade and the sun within your beds and grow a lot more. You can do the same thing by growing different types of plants based on how fast they grow. A perfect example of this is growing radishes in the same place that you're growing carrots, because the carrots take a lot longer to grow. You're going to need the spacing of the carrots because at some point they're going to get to full size and you want a nice big carrot. But until that point, radishes that grow very quickly can usually be grown in between the carrots. So essentially you get a double crop in the same space. And this holds true with many other plants, like squashes that might grow quickly. Well, you can grow them around some of the slower growing plants, like corn, growing 2 plants in the same spot. Expand your garden plan beyond in-ground and raised beds and start thinking about growing in containers, like these grow bags. This greatly expands the space that I'm growing in. This isn't a prepared bed, it's just a bunch of bags, and I've got potatoes growing in all these bags. I'm not wasting a lot of space that potatoes need in a regular bed. So in those other beds, I can grow a lot of vegetables. And then in the extra space in my garden, I have containers, pots, or bags to grow other edibles. It's one of those things that we can keep growing and keep expanding our garden without thinking about being tied down to a specific bed. At the end of the season, I can even take these bags inside to extend the season and grow food for a longer period of time. And the idea of taking containers indoors to protect it from cold weather and then bringing it back into the sun ties closely into the concept of succession planting, which is a great way to grow more in the same space. These are my garlic plants that have been in the ground for about 8 months now, and they're going to be ready to harvest probably next month. Well, I don't need to stop there. I don't need to say, okay, this bed is done, the garlic has been harvested. I still will have many months to go after that point. So succession planting tells me I can grow another crop after I harvest this one. And you can do that throughout your garden. Early spring, you can grow the plants that like cool weather. And then when all of those are harvested, you start growing the plants in summer that like hot weather. And then after those are harvested, you start growing more plants that like the cool weather of the fall. So you should be able to relatively easily get 3 complete distinctive crops from most of your beds through the growing season. It takes planning. It does take some extra effort, but you're getting a lot more food from every single bed. And this extra tip also takes a little bit of extra work, but it's really the reason we're doing all this gardening in the first place. We want to continue harvesting throughout the gardening season with as many plants as we can. Every time we pull off a leaf or a fruit, it stresses the plant and it causes the plant to send out more growth or more flowers and fruit. So like I already pointed out with spinach, we could wait until this spinach was fully grown, cut it down, and use that particular plant. But by stressing the plant, pulling off some of these outer leaves, we're encouraging the plant to send up new growth. So while we might get, say, 8 ounces of spinach from a single plant, we might be able to get a couple pounds of spinach from that same plant by continually harvesting. Harvest your tomatoes and the plant will be stimulated to send out more flowers and more fruit. Tomatoes, with peppers, with fruits, you can get more by stressing the plant through the harvest. You might not have that time. You may have to wait and just do it all at once, but that little bit extra effort will give you more. It doesn't work with everything. For carrots and radishes and beets and the rooting plants, once you pull up that root, well, the plant is done. You're not going to get another carrot from that same plant. But for all the other plants that we're growing, learn about your plant. You might be able to double or even triple by just harvesting on a regular basis. I find that growing in a raised bed actually enables you to grow more in a given space than an in-ground open bed. Now sure, an in-ground open bed, you can grow an awful lot of plants following these same basic methods, but they're ideally suited for a raised bed. In the ground, you can't necessarily grow right up to the edge of the path because as you walk along, you're going to disturb your plants. But you can grow right up to the edge of a raised bed and essentially gain that little bit extra, those few inches of where the path and the bed join. I can grow just 2 or 3 inches away from the side of the raised bed and really max out the plants that are growing. Square foot gardening is a very common method that incorporates a lot of these ideas. Well, running the strings to set up your square foot gardening grid is much easier in a raised bed than attempting to do the same thing in an in-ground bed. So, one of the reasons that I have raised beds in my vegetable garden is because I find I can grow more in the space of a raised bed than I can in open ground. As you start putting all these methods together to grow more food in less space, you need to keep in mind that your soil needs to be alive and healthy. Each of the plants will require a certain amount of nutrients. And if you start growing more plants closer together, and then you do succession planting, so you're growing more crops in a season, your soil is going to be giving up a lot of its nutrients to all of those plants that you're going to be harvesting. So while we might amend in the spring or the fall, well, with this really heavy growing, you're probably going to need to amend your soil in both the spring and the fall. And you may need to be more aware of some fertilizer needs if you know that your soil is deficient in specific nutrients. You have to keep your soil healthy, and you have to keep it growing within its own biosphere so that it can provide all those nutrients to the plants in this intensive growing operation. So don't lose sight of that. Learn more about your soil and what you need to do to keep it alive and to keep it filled with nutrients. Or else you might have a really good season, and if you forget about your soil, well, the next season, using these same methods might not be as successful. So soil is key. You have to pay attention to make all the rest of this work. And I have other videos that go into some of these subjects in much more depth. And so you can continue by learning a little bit more about this by watching one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.